Welcome to our webinar, guys. My name's Simon. I'm Head of Digital Transformation at Haig & Co. And today, if you can see, we're welcoming Michael Finocchiaro, Finocchiaro Consulting, in the first of our four-part series to discuss PLM and the cloud. I just briefly want to run over the setup for today. So just keep an eye out for some of the polls that will be popping up during the webinar. It'll be how you feel about the cloud, where you may be in your selection process. We really value your input on that, and also we'll have a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And myself and Fino will do our best to get through and answer those questions for you at the end. So yeah, I'll quickly go through the topics we're going to cover today, guys. So I'm going to present to you an introduction into PLM, essentially, and also explain what the cloud is, different types of services that are currently available to you out on the market at the moment. Now, the next coming weeks, so the next 2 weeks, we'll dive a bit further into some of the misconceptions of the cloud, and questions often asked by companies thinking about switching their functions to the cloud platform, as well as the benefits of doing so, and how this can help propel growth in the digital industry. And final week 4, as Fino may have mentioned earlier, if you heard, the tables are going to turn, and he'll be interviewing myself at Haig & Co. and how COVID has had an impact on the PLM job market and how we've sort of managed over this this period of time, what we've been up to. So quickly before we properly get into it, I've got a couple of stats for you guys, if I can kick off with, if I may. So Gartner says the cloud is one of the biggest innovations that define the 2010s, but 2020s will pave the way for total takeover. And they predict by 2025, 80% of enterprises will shut down their traditional data centers altogether and move to the cloud, leaving physical hubs and other server farms virtually redundant. And in terms of sort of market growth, the public cloud service market is expected to reach 623.3 billion, huge amount of money, by 2023. And 83% of enterprise workloads will be on the cloud by the end of 2020. And the cloud service, 30% of IT businesses, functions and budgets are going to be going towards sort of cloud computing. So, Fino, what would you say on that?
I would say that that's a good motivation to move on in the webcast because that's what we want to talk about. I just wanted to also interject that the target audience here are deciders, IT managers, CTOs, just people that want to understand the things that are at stake in terms of cloud, the common acronyms we throw around and what they mean, because this is part of my demystifying series that I've done around the blogs. We'll also have interviews after this first 4 episodes. It's a continuous effort. We want to continue this conversation with you over the coming months, and we want to interview other PLM vendors as well as influencers. And I think you may have seen on LinkedIn or on my YouTube channel some clips or little teasers from some of the folks I've talked to: Rob Ferroni of Quick Release, Leonel Gralu of X Lifecycle, Oleg Shilovitsky from OpenBOM, and many others. So look forward to announcements on the vendors we're going to talk about. And there's also a white paper we'll talk about at the end, but the people that are attending this webcast will have the privilege to get the part 1 of the white paper. So if we go for today, I think what were we going to talk about specifically today, Simon?
So COVID-19 has obviously had a big impact on the way people are working now. People working from home has become a norm for many businesses, many people, and I believe that will continue to shape the way we work, and the flexibility that businesses are going to need to offer their workforce is certainly over the next 12 to 18 months is going to continue on that trend, I believe. And the types of data is also need to be stored. It's a big factor in terms of security. People not physically being there on the site to manage that data and make sure implementations have been done thoroughly and how businesses want them to be done. And then there's been a huge change in the PLM market over the past sort of 20 years, moving from 2D through to 3D. Then you've got AI and virtual reality that's become more prevalent over the past few years. So then we're going to talk through some clouds and all the different types of cloud solutions that are now available, which is Fino is going to go through us.
Well, I think it's time for our first poll, actually, before we get to the next slide. Drum roll. Da, 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 da. There we go. So do you guys see it? So we wanted to know if you were in the two cloud crowd or not in the two cloud crowd? So are you someone that's already wanting to, happy with the cloud, or are you like firmly no, that's not for me at all? Wow, it looks like everybody. Oh no, there's some
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 aren't.
uh, some non-cloud people. Okay. Um, Side note for the people behind the curtain, this is the old survey that I gave you, and not the new questions I gave you just before the meeting, just for the last survey. To please fix those. Um, then back, so yeah, we've got, is that everybody? 20, I think there's two or three more. We'll just give this another 20 seconds, but looks like 85%, 17 out of the out there are already in the two cloud crowd. We'll have to work, Simon, to convince the three people that are in the not to cloud crowd,
Yeah,
or
well,
ask them why they're not,
it's
but we
sort of
need
in
to work
fitting
on it.
with the stats of earlier as well.
Yeah,
Eight,
the
eight,
85%.
so yeah, 83% of workloads are beyond the cloud. So they're hitting that.
Let's see. So we're sharing the results now. So we had about, yeah, as we said, it was actually right on the nose of what we saw earlier. Okay, well, let's see. Let's talk specifically about the two cloud, the, there we go. Sorry. Up. The two cloud crowd and the not two cloud crowd. So I don't know many of you were fans of the IT crowd show, but I found it was kind of a fun way to introduce this. So I was going to talk about some of the two cloud crowd things, and then I think Simon's going to address some of the not to cloud. So I think that some of the reasons, and you guys in the comments are welcome to disagree, of folks that are for the two cloud, for being in the two cloud crowd, is the first one is financial, because a lot of companies want to reduce the capital expenditure, the fact to pay upfront for the software and then pay a perpetual license cost years and years down the road. Moving to an OpEx model, an operated expenditure model, where you're paying more or less a steady rate month to month or trimester to trimester. That's been one of the motivations for people to move. Another one, of course, is reducing IT spend, because when you move to the cloud, you no longer need that big machine room, as Simon already mentioned. With COVID, it's harder and harder to send someone downstairs to turn the machine back on, or to reboot a server, or to plug it back in or something. So moving things to the cloud reduce the fact that we don't need those machines. We don't need the machine room with the air conditioning and the raised floor and all that kind of stuff. So there's a reduction in IT spend on the front end in terms of the real estate and things like that you have to do. We'll talk more about PLM cost on the next webcast, by the way. Another one is people like the idea of scalability, the fact that if they grow tomorrow by acquisition, or they just their market takes off, they don't have to go off and acquire new servers and go through the whole procurement process, which can be rather heavy and expensive. Whereas the cloud, with scalability, you just ask for more. Normally, almost all of them, you just assign more users and you get all that capacity more or less automatically. And I'd say one of the last factors for people going to the two cloud crowd is sort of peer pressure. I mean, we just said that there's 85% of companies are already thinking about moving to cloud. CEOs probably get in a room and immediately are like, "Are you on the cloud yet?" And if you feel kind of embarrassed if you're not. So I think there's quite a lot of peer pressure as well that's pushing there. But I think that the other three reasons I gave are good financial and technical incentives to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the reasons that we believe companies and people won't be wanting to go onto the cloud. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think data is the big one, and being scared about people being able to hack in, and again, being able to not physically do the old school of going down and turning things on and off. And change is a big one. Sometimes companies are nervous about change, and often mean a lot of investment, to some level of uncertainty, to potentially changing something that for them has worked fine for 15, 20 years. But then there's also, they don't want to sort of fall behind the pack of peer pressure. So it's finding that balance for them, really, I think. And do people think it's a fad? Is it going to be something that's going to be popular for the next 4 or 5 years, and slowly go off? But I'm sure we'll find out.
Yeah, I think that uh, there are things that are sort of faddish, like blockchain is already seeming to fade, but I don't think that, given that, well, I was going to mention, yeah, the fact that when you think about Windows, for the last 2 years, of course, Microsoft salespeople are only incented to sell on the cloud. And in fact, you can no longer use Office on the cloud anymore. I'm sorry, Office on-prem. You can't even use a normal version of Word. The only way you can use Word is by leveraging Office 365, which is on Azure services. So for a lot of the software that we use on a daily basis, it's only available on the cloud, and that usage is only going to increase over time.
Absolutely.
But I think that perhaps I need to explain to you guys some of these acronyms that I've already started to use. I've been accused of that in the past, and I'm trying to correct my ways. Um, in case folks are not that aware of these acronyms PLM and PLM, I was just going to take a minute to explain what they are. The CAD market started back when back in the late 80s, when we had computers that could do graphics, and we wanted to draw things on the computer so that we could do design rather than on paper, but on a computer. That, of course, quickly evolved to 3D data models, which started using lots and lots more data, bigger data and more complex data, which incented us to uh, manage that data, to do product data management, which was what PDM was, which was more or less managing the CAD files, which were getting into the tens of megabytes, which at the time where machines only had hundreds of megabytes was concerning. But we also started adding management of components and management of configurations. Then in the 90s towards the 2000s, that footprint of PDM started to grow horizontally rather quickly. But initially with verticals around things like classification management, workflow, portfolio management, project management, maintenance, pushing a little bit into the manufacturing area and so forth, as well as sourcing. So we started getting these vertical silos that were being built by each of the big platforms, as we'll talk about in a minute. But then we also had horizontal applications such as integration, because PLM, well, I didn't mention, but then we had the term PLM that was created, Product Lifecycle Management, when we're not just talking about the designing of the product in the initial cycle. Now we're talking about, well, how will that, how do I actually create that product? How do I sell it? How do I get suppliers to work on it to reduce my costs, and so forth. So we were going more into the life cycle of product, and that's where we came up with the word product lifecycle management. And then I was saying that there's now horizontal pieces that came into play around integrating with the ERP system, the system that's doing all the warehousing, procurement, and driving the manufacturing floor, connecting to all the other CAD platforms, because maybe my engineers were using CATIA and NX, or what was called actually at the time, now I'm having, well, they were using Pro Engineer or some other tool, so we needed to be integrated across multiple CAD systems. There was also the issue of visualization, because not everybody can actually understand a CATIA screen, so we needed to have a visualization. Unigraphics was the other one I was thinking, my apologies. So we needed a visualization tool so that people not experts could actually see the products we're talking about. Collaboration became extremely important. Of course, that plays into what we're talking about today on the cloud, because one of the pushbacks on collaboration was we couldn't collaborate with people that were outside our firewall. And lastly, reports and analytics. And what we'll see later as we talk about the market is that it's even expanding further. Dassault, in their latest release, is trying to actually carve out a piece of the CRM market. PTC made the acquisition of ThingWorx, which pushes them closer into the IoT market, also aided by the investment of Rockwell and Rockwell. Which pushes them even further into the industrial market. So each of the vendors is trying to expand that central place of PLM and creating products to cover more and more of the portfolio. So anyway, that's sort of where PLM came from. And if you look at the growth of the big ones, there's $3 billion. Well, actually, I didn't put Autodesk here, but the first three that came out of primarily out of acquisitions were Dassault, PTC, and Teamcenter. And for example, the Dassault had already a CAD product called CATIA. They were using a product from IBM called Product Manager, which they morphed into something called VPM V5. And then they bought a company around 2007 called Matrix One, and they merged those, and created something called Innovia V6. And then in 2015, I was part of the launch team. We created a 3D Experience, which is the platform on which all the applications in the Dassault portfolio run. At PTC, there was a company called Computer Vision that had already purchased services from a company that had given its temporary name of Windchill. PTC bought that company and then created the Windchill brand for all their PLM stuff, and that brand has been relatively consistent. It was around PTC 11 or Windchill 11 where PTC started having cloud solutions. So since PTC 11, probably a little bit before as well, but they started having solutions you could already buy in the cloud. And now I put up the new logo because they relaunched all their branding earlier this year at their kickoff, and they also announced a new cloud platform that's coming called Atlas, which we'll talk about in the third webcast. The other of the three vendors that are the biggest and have a CAD platform that's used by the most industries is Teamcenter. Teamcenter was actually the fusion of an older product called Unigraphics and iMan, which was the data management for Unigraphics, and some people that left another company called SDRC and had a really nice PDM called Metaphase, and they merged those two and they called it Teamcenter Unified. And in July of this year, they rebranded that again and they called it Teamcenter X. X is not 10 like the iPhone X, it's actually Accelerate, which is the entire portfolio of Siemens software. And so Teamcenter is the PDM, the PLM of that Accelerate portfolio. And that was announced about 2 weeks after PTC Atlas was announced. So that's sort of where we are in terms of the big guys. Now, if I show this chart, this is all the vendors that I'm going to talk about in the report and we're going to talk about in the third webcast. I've already sort of described that first line. I need to now talk a minute about Autodesk. So Autodesk is launched PLM 360 a few years back, actually, probably in the late 2000s, and then they it back, and now they have Autodesk Fusion Lifecycle, which deals with very specific markets, industries. Although it's very, very well structured, it's multi-tenant. So we'll talk again more about it in detail. But it's so they have a on cloud only CAD product that goes with it called Fusion 360. So it's a really quite interesting offer. Their focus primarily is around manufacturing, but especially on the building information management, the BIM market for construction. That's really where they are very dominant. Then the other one on the first line, Aras, I put there because they're the only one among all the other ones that sells entire PLM systems to the Fortune 500 and the top end of the Fortune 500, so they can compete head to head against PTC or Dassault or Siemens. And they have a platform called Innovator, which is one of the easiest ones, one of the first ones, the modern PLMs that was extremely easy to customize. And today it's sold as a managed service. We'll explain what that is in a second, although they are planning a SaaS. The second line are some of the other players that are considerably smaller and a little bit more focused on specific markets. So there's Arena. I wasn't able to talk to them. I could just say that they used to be bomb.com. Now they're Arena Solutions, and they're focused on a couple markets. OpenBOM from Oleg, who you might have seen my teaser. OpenBOM focuses on BOM, although they're spreading their portfolio out horizontally as well to cover other stuff. You'll notice I did not put SAP on there because you probably saw the announcement that SAP and Siemens have signed an agreement. So we can expect that rather than pushing SAP PLM, SAP will be pushing Teamcenter, and likewise Teamcenter, when they need a ERP, they're going to be pushing S4 HANA as the solution. I also put Oracle here because it's Oracle. They have a Product Lifecycle Cloud, which is sort of a umbrella of different functionality, which then connects down on premises to Oracle Agile. Again, we'll talk about it a little more, but they're very focused on formula management. So people that are using liquid, say shampoo, they do some new to product introduction, some other stuff in med devices, but they're really more of a niche player in terms of PLM. Propel PLM is very unique because they actually built their entire product using Salesforce, the Force.com platform. So natively, they already have all the advantages of Salesforce of being multi-tenant, very robust, excellent security via Shield, great tools for building interfaces and so forth. So very interesting. I had a great conversation with some guys there, and we'll talk more about them on webcast 3. And they've also agreed for a separate interview in this series. And then there's Upchain. Upchain's about, I think they launched in 17, so they're only 2 or 3 years old. Also a really interesting, disruptive approach to PLM, using a sort of a tribal approach and a 16-dimensional data model. More about that in the third webcast. on the last line are sort of even smaller but still fascinating players. I think just to provoke you guys, I put Microsoft Excel and Teams because honestly, if you look at the PLM market today, I think 95% of stuff of PLM is still done in Microsoft Excel. And of course, Microsoft Teams is taking over the space that used to be held by Skype and the other things for collaboration that Microsoft had. I think all the PLM vendors that we're talking about here have to deal with the fact that Excel is still used everywhere. Vendors like Upchain, for example, have actually integrated into Excel rather than just having a menu item. You can actually see the product structure inside the program. I think we're going to see more and more of that over time, and we'll talk a little bit about those trends in the third webcast. Eurostep, who is behind a lot of the the standardization in the PLM industry, has a really interesting product called Share a Space, which is for high-end supply chain management. So if a company is trying to build an airplane and they've got all these suppliers and they need to manage very specifically, almost down to a part by part level or even an attribute level, what information is shared between a certain collaborator, a group of collaborators, ShareSpace does an excellent job of handling that. There's a tiny little vendor in Germany that I really like. They're good, really good guys, Schwint. They have an unpronounceable product called Versch Cloud, which is a nice toolkit based on the 3D Experience platform, but really interesting, and we'll talk more about that. They've they've kind of recognized that Microsoft and Excel Teams thing I mentioned earlier, and they did a unique way of integrating that. And lastly, and Yuan actually is on the call, there's a really nice solution that Jan just announced recently called Ganister. It's a PLM that's probably the only one here. I might be wrong, but I believe it's the only one that's using a graph database. So it's all built on Neo4j, which makes querying complex relational data much, much easier. And we wish Jan, of course, lots of good luck. And I think Jan and I will probably do a webcast together, certainly to talk about it. But I think you guys will find that really interesting. So that's sort of my view on the vendors that I found the most interesting for now. Now, I promised to demystify a bit. So here's one of my demystification charts. We talk, again, we use a lot of acronyms in the industry. There's these acronyms of Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS, to not mispronounce it and say a rude word. There's PaaS, Platform as a Service, and SaaS. So this is a really old diagram from a white paper written by an IBM guy really a long time ago. But it kind of gives you an idea. It's not a perfect example because I would actually in the middle, on the second line, reverse the colors. But the idea is if you do on-prem, you have to do everything yourself. You have to acquire the servers, you have to install all the software, you have to get it all configured, and you have to run it day to day. So that's the made at home. You're going to go home, you've got your oven, you've got dough, you've got to roll out the dough, pour the tomato sauce. You get the idea. You do it all yourself. Then you have the take and bake. You go to the store, you buy the frozen pizza, you throw it in your own oven, and you cook it. Now, I was saying that it's not a perfect analogy because it would really be the other way around, right? The infrastructure as a service vendor would give you the oven and the electricity and the gas, and you're the one bringing the software to put into the oven, right? So I'd kind of reverse those two, but I hope you get the point. So the take and bake one. The third one is platform as a service. So in this case, it's like a pizza delivery, right? Everything is done for you. It's already all packaged up. You just have to serve it on your dining room table with soda. And of course, this was done by American. Here in Europe, we definitely have wine or beer rather than soda. So don't be
You're
worried
right
about
there.
that. However, again, and once again, I would flip that around. I would say that the platform as a service gives you everything except for the cheese and the toppings, because that's really what it would be. You would have everything ready to go, and you just would do cheese and toppings at the end, which would be the configuration of the system. Well, actually no, because you'd also have to do restarts. In a platform as a service model, you are managing the software. It's just that you don't have you're managing the start and stop and the configuration, but you just don't have to do the install of the software. If we go full SaaS, the software as a service, which is sort of the holy grail where several of the vendors I mentioned already have reached, is where you actually have nothing. In other words, you have no responsibility of the infrastructure. All of that is done by the SaaS vendor. So the Autodesk or the Dassault or the Siemens will manage everything for you. You don't have any machines. You don't have anything to install. You just have a web address. You log in and you start working, which is that's the SaaS model. Of course, the prices are different as we go up, and we'll talk much more detail on the pricing in the next webcast. Last but not least, the last technical slide before your heads blow up. This is more of a detail to explain the difference between those last two columns on the previous slide of PaaS versus SaaS. So a lot of vendors will call PaaS a managed service, and of course SaaS is a software as a service. So there's one term that's important to know in cloud computing called multi-tenant. That means on the same web server or the same database, I have several customers using the same application server. The data is segmented. Usually there'll be a tenant ID, one for each unique customer. And so the data never gets mixed in between customer and customer B. But at the end of the day, it's a much cheaper way of delivering software because I only have to manage the one environment. I don't have to manage n environments for end customers, and I can also leverage the hardware much better and leverage the databases behind. Typically, a managed service can never be multi-tenant by definition because if you if you start and stop the server, you've just killed every other customer on the system. So typically, a PaaS is not multi-tenant. SaaSes can or cannot be. There are some SaaSes like the DS Private Cloud or PTC Windchill today. That'll probably change with Atlas, but PTC Windchill today is a mono-tenant or a single-tenant software, but it's managed in a SaaS mode. You just have a URL. The customer in a software as a service doesn't need to worry about patching. We'll see that in a minute. And everything is managed for it. So it's typically SaaS is multi-tenant, but there are cases where it's mono-tenant. Another difference is that the older geeks like me, we always like the old command lines. We could get in with VI, and I was a VI guy, not an Emacs guy, okay? But you get in VI and you hack. Well, that's never going to happen on that you can do still on a PaaS. You can't do that on a SaaS because if you start mucking around, you could start messing up someone else's environment because everybody's running on the same stuff. So typically on a SaaS, you don't have the command line, whereas in a PaaS you do. Probably the place where the people spend the most money and spend the most time and have the most incredible frustration in PLM and in software in general is upgrades and patching, because as soon as you start customizing the software to do what you want, the software vendor inevitably will come out with a patch that's going to break whatever you did, and it's a mess. I'm sure the folks that are on the call that have done PLM for any amount of time have always found that really painful. That's something that you still have to do as a managed service. Sometimes the vendor will take on, the service provider will do that for you, but it's usually a manual process. For a SaaS vendor, that's one of the great advantages of SaaS is that the vendor does it all for you. We'll see on the next webcast, there's some vendors who will let you wait before you do the latest version. Some other vendors like Dassault will just warn you 2 weeks before, we're upgrading and now everything is at the new version. So it relieves you of a lot of pain of having to worry about upgrades and patching. That's another feature of SaaS. In terms of customization on a managed system where I have control over everything, of course, I have just enough rope, as we say in English, to hang myself. I can customize a lot, but then, as I just mentioned, that will possibly and most likely hurt my chances for successful upgrade. With the SaaS, it sort of depends. There's some SaaS vendors that are extremely good on customization. I would say Autodesk, Upchain, OpenBOM, and Propel as the ones I mentioned, where you can do everything you can do on on-prem, you can do through the UI, through the user interface on the cloud. And then you have other ones that's a little more difficult. Teamcenter X is very, very young, and they're only allowing a limited amount of customization on Teamcenter X unless you go for the personalized, which is a little more expensive. On Dassault, it's a marked difference between what you can do on-prem and what you can't. Again, things we're going to talk about in the next two webcasts. Quickly for the last three, configuration files. As you can imagine, if you have to edit a file and restart the server, you can only do that on a managed server, right? You cannot do that in a SaaS environment because, again, you're breaking everybody. So all the vendors that had all this information and configuring stuff in config files had to revisit that architecture in order to be a SaaS, because there's no way you can use those files individually for each customer. In terms of a VPN, so using a virtual private network, a tunnel basically to get to the software as it's more secure. Most PaaSes are done that way, so you're running in a data center and you use a virtual private network to access those servers. With a SaaS, it depends. You can have a SaaS where you do access it through a VPN, but you also have ones that are just running on the public internet. The DS Public Cloud, Autodesk Fusion Lifecycle, a lot of the solutions at OpenBOM as well are just on the web. I think many of them you can ask for a VPN as an option, but It's not necessary, which means it's easier for suppliers and people outside your organization to connect. Lastly, and we've already mentioned how important this is external integrations. With PaaS, that's always the case because you have control of the software. You can make the modifications, the customizations that are necessary. On a SaaS, it's vendor dependent. So that might influence your choice of which SaaS vendor to choose, depending on whether they have already integrations for your particular ecosystem. This usually means you have a representational state transfer, a REST API set. Most of the vendors have released that. Again, we talk about that in the next webcast. But some of them also will have prepackaged integrations, and some of them will have third-party integrations using partners like MuleSoft or Jitterbit. So we'll talk about that some more, but that's another place where when you're deciding which vendor, you need to look carefully on what you have and what's already there for these vendors.
Cheers, Fino. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think I myself have certainly learnt a little bit more about PLM, cloud, and ISS, PASS, and SASS um, uh, over this evening. So yeah, let's have another poll now, Fino, and see how we've helped anyone with their decisions and moving on to the cloud platform.
Okay, so yes, I'm on the two cloud crowd. Can you tell me more about moving into the cloud with PLM? Number two would be still on the fence. You're doing another one of these, right? Oh, I got cut off. Nah, I'm not in the two cloud crowd. Sorry. Or I'm in the two cloud crowd. Is there a T-shirt? So it looks like we've got more or less fans here. Ah, there's one that's still on the fence. Okay, well, we'll work on that. But it looks like our ratios go. Ah, we're down to 75%. We're going back up again. So we'll give about a minute on this one. I think
Yeah.
I forgot, and while people are filling that out, I think I forgot a critical example of SaaS that I used when we were practicing. I forgot to mention it. If you're still confused about SaaS, think about Facebook. You know, you use Facebook on a daily basis, you use Gmail, and you've never seen a Facebook server. You've not actually seen anything about it. All you know is you have URL. That's what SaaS is. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. That's probably the easiest way to understand it. Um, we have 17. Oh, come on, there's how many people do we have left
Give
that
them,
haven't answered yet? Put their
give
hand
them
up.
another 30 seconds or so to
All right.
answer. We'll,
Okay. Well, I hope that the other people didn't fall asleep. Ah, we got another guy. Okay.
I
Great.
mean, I think it's great to see that we've obviously helped sort of educate some of the people watching today, and they want to hear some more about the cloud as well, and more about PLM as well over the next few weeks.
Great. Do you want to talk about the summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, in summary, guys, the cloud's quite it's the logical next step in terms of continued development. When you're looking at remote working and and how businesses have grown in 2020, and no doubt continue to grow into 20 and 21 as well. Um, all the big players in the PLM market have got a sort of slice of the pie, so to speak, some bigger than others. But that, of course, gives the customer a wide range of solutions and options to choose from when considering which solution to go with. I think this is a good thing. I think it makes it a competitive market. It makes vendors have to it makes vendors have to continue to invest and improve and vie for those positions in the market. So yeah, in the next webinar, we'll be going a little into a bit further into that, and cover some of the frequently asked questions and misconceptions of clouds and the PLM market. So yeah, let's jump into the Q&A session, guys. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the box at the bottom, and we'll get on with those.
Fantastic. Well, I think you already had one for me, didn't you? Oops, sorry. Didn't you already have a question for me?
Should I be concerned about the security of my IP when going to the cloud?
That is probably remember that was one of the first objections of the not to cloud crowd. We'll go into depth about that one next week. I think it's a concern, not in terms of your random hacker, but more a concern of industrial espionage. And so there are solutions for it. There's encryption of data at rest. There's using SSL all the way through. There's having your cloud vendor being SOC 2 Type 2 and ISO 27001 2013 certified. Um, so it is a legitimate concern, but I think there are legitimate answers to how we can ensure that your moving to cloud is at least as safe as it is on premise. I wouldn't say safer, but I would say that we can assure about the same amount of security as we have on-prem. And again, I'll explain that in webcast 2, in episode 2 of the To Cloud Crowd webcast.
Absolutely. If you've got any more questions, just pop in the box, guys.
Well, did you have another one for me?
How much more, from an anonymous attendee, how much more cost effective is cloud, say over a 10-year period?
Okay, great question. Again, we talk about that a bit next week. The short answer is that initially the cost is far lower because you don't pay the hardware up front. It depends on how successful your deployment is in a sense. Because if you think about it, the hardware you're going to depreciate over 3 to 5 years. The cloud cost will increase as you add more solutions and more users to it. And therefore, I would say that it's very important for cloud deployment to start showing real benefit to the customer in order to justify the increased cost. But it's a much more predictable linear cost as opposed to the cost that you get with on-premises software. And of course, you don't have the unpredictability of an upgrade migration going horribly wrong because those things are all handled by the SaaS vendor. So I hope that helps for that one. Again, we talk more about that next week in the next webcast.
Got a question coming from Andy Scott. If you use Facebook as an example, the method that people communicate with each other has changed over time. For example, initially friends reunited. If you wish to move to a different vendor, how easy is it to get the data out from the clouds from one vendor and send it to the next?
Absolutely fantastic question. Thank you very much. That brings up the issue of vendor lock-in, which is what most people are worried about. We talk about that next week. The vendors have different approaches. Some of the vendors are very upfront about you click a button and you get your data. Other ones, it's a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about that next week, but I'd say most of the cases, it's not that difficult to get your data out and move. In most of the cases, however, I would ensure that when you sign when you read very carefully your end user, your EULA, your end user license agreement, that it's specifically stated there that the data that you create in the system still belongs to you, and that when you are terminating your contract with the vendor, that you get all your data back, so that you have some kind of a legal foundation. Because there have been instances, non-public instances of customers having issues, but those things were eventually resolved, unfortunately, with lawyers. But I think if you bring that up front, then, and some of the vendors again are very forthcoming about their opt-out policy, then you should be okay. And we'll talk about those vendors next time.
Cheers, Vinay. We've got a question coming from Jeff Harris. So what happens when your net connection fails? Downtime. His last job in Basildon, UK, was on a server at the customer in the USA, and that alone was a complete pain.
Yeah, well, that is the one thing we can't really we can't really plan for network outages. Fortunately, for most of the developed world, those network outages tend to be a couple of microseconds that kind of then what's the word I'm looking for? Propagate through a network. The cloud in general is designed to be an online system. It assumes that the users are already connected. Now, for CAD products, if I take CATIA for example, because I worked the longest at Dassault Systems, CATIA is able to work without a server for a certain amount of time because it doesn't need to do change management every 2 seconds. You can do some design without it. However, it is true, and it is the one downside is that, yeah, if you've got no network, you've got to wait till the network comes back. However, if we're really honest, we have that same problem on-prem too. I mean, how many times are you in a company and somebody, kicked the network cable out of the back of the server? It sounds really dumb, but I've seen that, more than once. And so network glitches are unfortunately something we live with in the computer world, and we've lived with them for forever. Um, so I'd say yes, it is potentially an issue, and it's sort of problematic, but I think that on-prem you could argue that that could also be problematic. And even with if you have the thing on-prem and you're traveling remotely, now you can't get to the VPN, it's actually kind of worse. Whereas if I'm in the cloud, I could have a network glitch, but at least without a VPN or with a solid VPN, I can actually get to the server and still work. So I'd say it's another one of those issues that you could answer either way, but I don't think it's a strong argument against cloud because I think on-premise also has some vulnerabilities in that manner.
Yeah, fantastic. Cheers, yeah. John White's got a question. What's the impact on return on investment calculations comparing SaaS, software as a service, versus owned and infrastructure environment?
Well, I think we talked about that earlier in terms of the cost. We talk about that a little more in detail the next time. Again, it's the difference between CapEx, so a capital expenditure of paying upfront hardware. Um, every time you need an upgrade of the hardware, you've got to physically do the procurement process, stop the machines, install the hardware, restart, hope nothing breaks, hope everybody, did their static check before they touch the machine. Um, that's not a cost issue, but what I'm saying is that you have that upfront cost, and then you have the PLC. The difference with SaaS is that you're paying almost all that computer, networking, electricity. That's all built into your SaaS per user cost. So that really briefly, in the SaaS model, you're paying basically named users. That named user also includes the infrastructure. So typically, a SaaS license costs 20% more than a on-premise or PaaS managed services one, particularly more than on-prem because the PaaS also includes hardware. So let's say it's about a 20% bump for cloud. Uh, but you're getting, again, a predictable number every month, right? Because every month you'll be paying that same amount for all those users until you say, I'm going to add more users, which you can predict in advance. I'm going to add another module, which you can pick in advance. And some of the vendors, particularly like OpenBOM, you're all in. Once you've paid the price for the license, and Oleg even has what he calls a company license, where you've got basically infinite users and every application that he does. So in that case, it's a completely predictable price. So I'd say that's kind of the rub between, do you really want to manage the hardware and the IT and all the upgrades yourself, or do you pay a little more every month for each of the named users, but you never have to worry about that stuff again? It's a calculation to make.
Okay, fantastic. I've got quite an interesting question coming from Alok here. So there are several export control rules when it comes to military change management data. If there are several countries working together on a military data and each country has a dedicated rule, is it easy to deal with that in a cloud environment?
Fantastic question. Thank you very much, Alok. Um, That's a complicated one. It also is very solution dependent. We'll talk next week about the vendors that have ITAR and the ones that do not, and the ones that are FedRAMP and the ones that are not. Um, it can be kind of complicated, and it's going to be very vendor specific because it really depends on the rules in terms of the citizenship and the location of the person who's collaborating on what. Um, Platforms, I think, I could be wrong, and I invite the vendors that are listening to this to correct me, but maybe Teamcenter might be one of the better ones at that because they're already FedRAMP compatible. I think PTC as well. PTC just won, as you may have seen, a huge contract at the Navy for their digital thread initiatives, and that's also sometimes working with other countries like the UK. So I'd say those two of the huge vendors are definitely good. And we'll talk the next time about some of the smaller vendors, which ones because what you need to look for is FedRAMP and ITAR compliance, basically, and then some of the other compliancy stuff. So I hope I answered, but I'd say it is possible, but it sometimes can be complex, and it's going to be a different answer depending on which vendor you talk to.
Okay, fantastic. There's one from Richard. So when finding resources to help with new implementations, how important have you found it in the past for them to have specific product experience?
Uh, Again, I'm sorry for using the same answer, but I think it depends on the platform again. Um, the thing is that the trend to cloud, the good thing there is that it's a big shift away from programming skills, right? Because before you really did have to have the person that's already been doing CA8, DASO CA8 for years and understood the data model and had to do it. With solutions like Autodesk Fusion Lifecycle or OpenBOM or Upchain or Propel, you really don't need to know anything about the underlying system. You might need a little bit of JavaScript, and I think almost every self-respecting programmer knows how to write JavaScript now. And you know how to use a mouse, right? Because a lot of it is drag and drop. Um, what I like also, if we look at Teamcenter X, is the Mendix platform, which is low code. So it's really easy to write stuff that actually is able to call the APIs of Siemens IoT platform that's called MindSphere, as well as Teamcenter, the PLM platform. Um, so I'd say that today, for some of the vendors, yeah, you really do need that experience for Agile, for Dassault, for the previous versions of Teamcenter, and for some pieces of the Windchill system. But for the newer vendors, and as we go forward in time, those differences are going to be smaller and smaller because we're going to be more in the drag and drop, WYSIWYG, JavaScript world. And so those skills, specific platform skills, will be less important. It's always good to have someone that's had experience on the platform because they're going to know where some of the loopholes are going to be and where some of the gaps in the documentation might be. But over time, those skills are probably a little less critical. Like you probably just have a consultation from an expert, and then your JavaScript programmers sort of take over, I think.
Okay, fantastic. Well, quite an interesting one from Paul Mitchell here as well. What's the amount of flexibility available with the software as a service model? Different companies have different product data processes using the same application. Are there sort of configuration opportunities within that?
Yes, great question. Thank you. Um, I'm not, well, I'll answer it the way I interpret it. If I got it wrong, then ask me again or come next week and ask me. Um, Yes, there's a lot of flexibility. I mentioned multi-tenant. So on multi-tenant, that's actually lots of companies running on the same server, but all keeping their data separate. If you're talking more about collaboration, all the platforms offer some sort of collaboration which allows you to bring in suppliers. If you're talking about really doing a collaborative design with equal partners rather than an OEM and subcontractors, then I mentioned earlier Eurostep Share Space, which is an extraordinarily powerful platform specifically designed for that case of a short-term experience between pairs, between people on the same level that are trying to share data without compromising their own internal IT. So I'd say that it depends on what level of the supply chain you're working and what level of collaboration. If you're talking about an OEM and tier ones and tier twos, or if you're talking about several OEMs. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. One from Nagarajan here. What if cloud providers change their cost model, i.e., suddenly see a rising cost? How easy is it to go to on-premise from cloud?
You guys are great. I'm loving these questions. Thank you so much. This is great. Um, that's related to the opt out question that I mentioned earlier, right? So some of the vendors, we'll talk about them next time. Some of the vendors do allow you to move the code, sometimes free, sometimes at cost, from SaaS to PaaS down to on-prem. For instance, I was told by Teamcenter that that was definitely something they could do. Windchill is able to do that as well, depending on the customization you did. Um, so yeah, some of the vendors do actually allow you to do that. Aras is already a pass, and so that's pretty easy to move that one on-prem. However, if you take a SaaS only vendor, Autodesk, Upchain, OpenBOM, Propel, or Arena, uh, there is no on-prem version, right? So in those cases, no, you can't. You can probably extract your data, as we talked about the opt-out, and then attempt to re-import that data in another system, but they don't have an on-premise solution, so you've got what you got, right? So again, your mileage will vary depending on which vendor you've got. The ones that have on-premise solutions in general have some way of moving back, although some of them is a little more difficult, like that, so it's relatively hard. But for the vendors that are SaaS only, well, it's SaaS only.
So, cheers. Got a couple of more questions. First, it's gone from Greg. How is COVID impacting PLM deployments onto the cloud?
Well, we're early, right? I mean, this crisis hit us in February, March for most of the world, and so I think that even Simon and Haig can say that in terms of recruiting, it's been challenging. I think people have slowed down. However, the reason and I thank you for asking because that's sort of the whole reason we're doing these that Damien and I discussed and decided this was a great time to do a webcast like this, is that we feel that with the fact that we all have to work remotely and that cloud technologies for PLM have matured vastly, as we discussed earlier today, that it's something that customers are going to have to evaluate. Again, Microsoft has already moved everything there, so you're already using the cloud today if you're using Word, PowerPoint, or Excel, and we've already said that 85% of PLM is already done in Excel, therefore, ergo, they're already using the cloud for PLM, right? So I'd say that it's something customers are going to have to ask themselves. There are things like particularly regulatory markets where you've got to ensure that your vendor has a story around regulation. I know Arena does, I know Autodesk does, and so forth. Uh, and you're going to have to look at moving your data. So in a lot of cases, I think what we're going to see companies that have a legacy of what Lionel Gralu, who I believe may still be on the call, what he calls a brownfield implementation, where I've already implemented on-prem. Maybe it's better in order to get experience with the cloud to take a new project, a new piece of your portfolio, and do that one on cloud, and then in the background start thinking about how those process, basically see how well that PLM adapts to your unique processes. And if you're happy with it, then you can start thinking about a bigger migration of the rest of your processes on the cloud. So I'd say that it kind of depends. I think we're a little early for some of those buying decisions, but I think we will see a wave of companies moving towards the cloud. And Haig & Co is here to help people do the recruiting for that, and Finocchiaro Consulting is here to help you understand the ins and outs and how to make that decision, and then how to ultimately do that digital transformation.
Fantastic. Cheers for now. Finally, we've got last one from Juan. Will we be discussing the business model comparing actual software as a service subscription, sort of monthly fee, with a potential real per traction cost? For example, with the COVID situation, companies may have reduced their usage of software even though they had the same amount of employees.
I'm not sure how to answer that one. I do have actual cost on the next presentation. There will be, I'll have the prices there. I don't know about what all the companies are doing. I can state that, for example, Upchain, one of the unique things they do is they have a training program. So when you become potentially an Upchain customer, they take you through what is PLM training class that they call Connect the Chain, or is it Connect? Yeah, I think it's called Connect the Chain. Sorry if I got that name wrong, John and James, you'll correct me, but I think it's called Connect the Chain. And so you go through this training process, and I believe that if you look on Upchain's website, it says that for folks that did the Connect the Chain, they get a discount on users during the COVID crisis. So I think you will see some effort on the part of some of the vendors to compensate for the loss of revenue that people are seeing because of outages due to COVID. But I can't speak to specific cases other than that one of Upchain, which again you can look on their website. But we will be talking. Like the thing is that not all vendors publish their prices, and so I can't obviously quote prices that I've seen that have been on tenders because that would be a violation of NDAs and so forth and so on. But the ones that are on public websites, they're all in my next webcast, and so we'll be talking about those.
Fantastic. Well, that was the last question we've got in the chat. So yeah, thank you for your questions, guys. For those that have joined us today, have you got one more question? Oh, there we go. How acceptable is cloud PLM, software as a service, PAS, for large enterprises, considering they have hugely complex business processes? I support, supports multiple Teamcenter PLM applications. All production apps are on premises cloud, and only few use Amazon IaaS for different environments or development environments.
So the question was, how does cloud help in that situation? Is that sort of what the question?
Um, yeah, how acceptable is Cloud PLM for
Right.
large enterprises, considering they have have
Well,
hugely complex business processes?
I think again, it's the famous. It's going to be my new mantra. Your mileage will vary, but I think it is possible. Again, I know of other very large auto manufacturers and very, very large aircraft manufacturers. I know of very large companies that produce electricity that all have huge deployments, and they're all very hard going after cloud. Now, these companies in particular will probably not at all be able to take advantage of SaaS because they're going to want their own instance. They're going to want their own, VPNs. The security requirements will probably not cover it on a SaaS. However, it's very possible that the SaaS offerings will work. And you mentioned Teamcenter. Teamcenter has already a federated model. And my understanding, talking to the folks at Teamcenter, and I actually have another interview scheduled with them before our final call. Teamcenter has a federated data model where I can actually federate multiple instances of Teamcenter, including PaaS instances and theoretically including SaaS instances. And this is all because they've got this nice active workspace front end behind which I can put any number of systems. Now, theoretically, you may be able to do that to a lower degree with 3D experience, although it would be a relatively superficial sort of a read-only probably way of doing it because of the specificity of that platform. I'd have to ask the folks at PTC. I'm talking to them next week about how that federation concept would work there. And I think those would be the only three customers we'd be talking about in that case. ARAS, that might work as well. I'm not sure what their federation policy is. I don't think you'd be able to do that today with the SaaS only ones, with Upchain and so forth, because I just don't think that they have the breadth, and they may not have the flexibility for the business processes. But for the first three we mentioned, probably Teamcenter might be the furthest ahead on that curve, PTC, and then Deso after that. So I hope I answered that one. We can talk a little bit more about it next time too.
Okay, fantastic. Cheers. Any more questions, guys?
Well, we hope you enjoyed it. We hope you had a good time today, and that we enjoyed it enough that you'll come back and hear us again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, thank you for your time today, guys. So everyone that was signed up to this will be automatically signed up for the second webinar, and you'll also be sent the part one of Fino's white paper. So yeah, to get part two, you'll have to join us on the 10th of September for the second installment.
You can also come to my website, bettercallfino.com, for extracts and the video teasers and stuff. And we're thinking about a podcast. Maybe you guys can send us some messages if you like that idea.
I will also send you out the PowerPoint presentation as well if you want to have a little look over that as well.
And please socialize. This was we went from like 30 people last week to filling it in the last few days, basically through LinkedIn. Through some of you, thank you very much for doing shares and reshares and likes. So please continue to do that and tell your colleagues, if the people that might benefit from learning more about cloud. We'd love to talk to them. We limited this one to 100, and if you guys tell us you've got, if you bring more people, we'll open it up and make it bigger next time.
Certainly, yeah.
Well, and we wanted to also thank Damien for his behind the curtain work, and Lucy for her fantastic work and some of the editing she's done in the back. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Simon, for being such a fantastic MC today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Fino, for joining us as well.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Yeah, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers, guys.